Professor Richard Wilson had a reputation at Westfield University. Students both feared and respected him in equal measure. He'd been teaching advanced calculus for over 20 years, and he took a strange pride in watching students struggle with the hardest problems mathematics had to offer. It was the first Monday of the fall semester, and a fresh batch of students filed into his classroom. Some looked confident, others terrified. They had all heard the stories about Professor Wilson's infamous first-day challenge. The classroom itself felt intimidating. High ceilings, wooden desks arranged in perfect rows, and walls lined with the portraits of famous mathematicians who seemed to judge anyone who dared enter their domain. The windows were tall and let in streams of autumn sunlight that highlighted the chalk dust floating in the air. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus 401, Professor Wilson announced as he walked to the front of the room. He wasn't particularly tall, but his presence commanded attention. His gray hair was carefully combed, and his tweed jacket had patches on the elbows from years of leaning against chalkboards. "Some of you may have heard that I begin each semester with a challenge." He paused, scanning the room. 34 students looked back at him with varying degrees of anxiety. "The rumors are true." A collective sigh filled the room. Some students exchanged nervous glances while others straightened their notebooks, trying to appear ready for whatever was coming. "In my 23 years of teaching, this problem has never been solved by a first-year student." Professor Wilson turned to the board and picked up a piece of chalk. "In fact, it stumped 2 of my colleagues in the department last year." The chalk squeaked against the board as he wrote out a complex, multivariable integration problem. It filled nearly half the board with symbols, notations, and requirements that made even the most prepared student's eyes widen. "This," he said, tapping the board with his knuckle, "is what separates the merely good from the truly exceptional minds in mathematics." Among the students, a young man with glasses whispered to his neighbor, "Is he serious? That looks impossible." Professor Wilson heard him. "Yes, Mr. Chen, I am entirely serious. And while it may appear impossible, I prefer the term unachievable, at least for undergraduates." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You have until Friday to attempt a solution." Lily Park, sitting in the 3rd row, studied the problem with intense concentration. She had graduated top of her class in high school and had never encountered a math problem she couldn't solve. This one, however, made her stomach tighten with doubt. "Professor," she called out, raising her hand, "has anyone ever come close?" Professor Wilson placed the chalk down and dusted his hands. "An interesting question. 3 years ago, a student managed to solve approximately 70% before making a critical error in his approach. I still have his work framed in my office as a reminder of how close brilliance can come to greatness, without quite reaching it." The classroom fell silent as students copied the problem into their notebooks. Some took photos with their phones, knowing they'd need to study every detail. "I don't expect anyone to solve it," Professor Wilson continued. "The purpose of this exercise is to humble you. Mathematics requires humility. Once you recognize the limits of your current abilities, true learning can begin." In the back corner of the room sat Grace Thompson. Unlike most of the students who had come directly from high school to university, Grace was 41 years old. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a button-up blouse, and comfortable shoes. Nothing about her appearance suggested she might be special in any way. Grace had taken a very different path to this classroom. 20 years ago, she had dropped out of community college when she became pregnant with her first child. Life had taken her through raising 3 children, working multiple jobs, and eventually securing a position on the university's maintenance staff. For years, she had cleaned classrooms like this one late at night, sometimes pausing to study the equations left on the boards. When her youngest child started high school 2 years ago, Grace had begun taking night classes. Her natural talent for mathematics had surprised everyone, including herself. Now, through a special program for university staff, she had earned a spot in Professor Wilson's advanced class. As she looked at the problem on the board, Grace didn't feel the same intimidation as her classmates. Instead, she felt curiosity. The problem reminded her of patterns she had observed while helping her middle child build a treehouse. The way weight distributed across uneven supports, the balance points, the structural integrity questions they had solved through trial and error. "Now," Professor Wilson said, breaking her concentration, "let's move on to the actual syllabus for this course." For the next hour, he outlined his expectations, grading policies, and the textbooks they would need. Students took notes dutifully, but the challenge problem loomed large in everyone's mind, casting a shadow over everything else. When class ended, students gathered their things quickly. Many headed straight to the library, determined to at least make an attempt at the impossible problem. A few approached Professor Wilson with questions, but he offered little encouragement. "Remember," he told a particularly persistent student, "this exercise isn't about success. It's about understanding failure." Grace packed her notebook slowly, watching this interaction. She had an afternoon shift cleaning the science building in an hour, but before that, she wanted to sit quietly with the problem. She found a bench under an oak tree in the courtyard and opened her notebook. The problem stared back at her. While the other students saw it as a mountain too steep to climb, Grace saw it differently. She broke it down into smaller pieces in her mind, the way she broke down household budgets or work schedules. "That's Professor Wilson's impossible problem, isn't it?" Grace looked up to see Professor Rivera from the physics department standing nearby. She had cleaned his office many times over the years. "Yes," she replied. "First day of class and he's already trying to break our spirits." Professor Rivera laughed. "That's Richard for you. He's been using that same problem for years. Says it teaches students their place in the mathematical universe. Have you ever tried to solve it?" Grace asked. "Once at a faculty dinner after too much wine. I made it about halfway before giving up." He glanced at her notes. "You're taking his class?" "I didn't know you were a student here now." Grace nodded. "Staff educational program. Took me a while, but I finally qualified for advanced courses." "Well, good luck with that problem. And with Richard. He's brilliant, but—" Professor Rivera hesitated. "Let's just say he has very fixed ideas about who can excel in mathematics." After Professor Rivera left, Grace returned to the problem. She didn't approach it the way her classmates would, with formal proofs and established methods. Instead, she looked for real-world parallels, practical applications that might provide insight. As she needed to leave for her shift, Grace packed up her notebook. The problem would wait. Unlike her younger classmates who could dedicate their entire evening to the challenge, Grace had to clean 3 floors of the science building, then go home to help her youngest with homework, prepare dinner, and handle household chores. Her time with mathematics had to fit into the small spaces between responsibilities. Yet as she mopped floors that evening, her mind kept returning to the problem. She saw connections to the curve of the stairwell she cleaned, to the way water flowed across the tile when she mopped. Mathematics wasn't just abstract symbols on a board to Grace. It was alive in the world around her. By the time she clocked out at 8 p.m., she had mentally solved one section of the problem using an approach she doubted any of her classmates would consider. It wasn't elegant or theoretically pure, but she suspected it would work. Driving home in her 15-year-old car, Grace smiled to herself. Professor Wilson had called the problem unachievable to humble his students. But Grace had already been humbled by life many times over. She had nothing to lose and everything to prove. Not to the professor, but to herself. What Professor Wilson didn't understand was that sometimes, the most powerful solutions come from minds that haven't been trained to see limits. Sometimes the person who solves the impossible problem isn't the one with the most impressive background, but the one who sees the world through different eyes. The challenge had just begun. The next morning, Grace woke up before her alarm. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that only exists before sunrise. She slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her youngest son, Alex, who wouldn't need to be up for school for another 2 hours. In the kitchen, she made coffee and spread her notes across the small table. The wood was worn from years of homework, family dinners, and late-night bill-paying sessions. Now it held the pieces of Professor Wilson's impossible problem. Grace had always done her best thinking in these early morning hours. Back when the children were babies, she'd treasured these moments of clarity before the day's demands took over. Now, with her oldest 2 in college and Alex in his final year of high school, she had more of these quiet moments. Still, old habits remained, and dawn found her working while the rest of the world slept. She traced her finger along the equation she'd written yesterday. The first section made sense to her now. She could see how the variables connected in ways that weren't obvious at first glance. It reminded her of the time she'd fixed their old washing machine by identifying a pattern in the way it failed. Everyone had told her to call a repair service, but Grace had observed, made connections, and solved the problem herself. "Mom, what are you doing up so early?" Alex stood in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep, looking older than Grace was ready for him to be. "Just working on a school problem," she said, smiling. "Go back to sleep. You've got another hour." He shuffled over to look at her notes instead. "Is that calculus?" "Looks crazy complicated." "It is," Grace admitted. "My professor says it's unsolvable." Alex frowned. "Then why are you trying to solve it?" Grace considered the question. Why was she pouring precious time into a problem designed to make her fail? Because sometimes people tell you something's impossible just because they haven't seen it done yet. Alex nodded, understanding more than she expected. "Like when you went back to school and Grandma said you were too old?" "Exactly like that," Grace said, touching his cheek affectionately. "Now how about you help me make breakfast before you go back to bed?" Together they cooked eggs and toast, talking about Alex's upcoming track meet and college applications. Grace treasured these moments, the normal, everyday conversations that grounded her life in something real. When Alex mentioned being nervous about his calculus class, Grace showed him how she approached difficult problems. "Don't just memorize the formulas," she told him. "Try to understand why they work. Math isn't magic. It's describing things that actually happen in the world." After Alex left for school, Grace cleaned up and got ready for her own day. Tuesday meant she had Professor Wilson's class at 11 a.m., then a shift cleaning the administrative offices from 2 p.m. until 8. Somewhere in between, she needed to make progress on the challenge problem. The university campus was busy when Grace arrived. Students moved between buildings with purposeful energy, carrying coffee cups and backpacks. Grace felt both part of this world and separate from it. For years she had been invisible here, just another maintenance worker keeping the spaces clean. Now as a student she occupied an in-between place. She arrived at the classroom early and chose the same seat as yesterday, back corner, good view of the board. Other students filtered in gradually, many looking tired. Grace overheard snippets of their conversations. "I was up until 3 working on Wilson's problem. I tried 3 different approaches. Nothing worked. My roommate's brother had Wilson 2 years ago. Says nobody ever solves it." Professor Wilson entered exactly on time, not a minute early or late. He placed his worn leather briefcase on the desk and surveyed the room. "I assume you've all had a chance to look at Monday's challenge," he began. "Any brave souls want to share their progress? Or lack thereof?" The room remained silent. A few students looked down at their notebooks, avoiding eye contact. No volunteers? Then perhaps Mr. Chen, since you were so vocal yesterday about the problem's impossibility. The young man with glasses from yesterday straightened in his seat. I tried using a substitution method for the inner integral, but I couldn't resolve the boundary conditions." Professor Wilson nodded. "A common approach. And a common failure point. Anyone else?" Lily Park raised her hand hesitantly. "I attempted to use Green's theorem to convert the surface integral, but the region isn't simply connected, so I got stuck." "Interesting attempt. Fizz Park, at least you recognize the topology issue. That puts you ahead of most first-year students." The professor turned to write something on the board. "Today we'll begin our actual coursework with a review of multivariable differentiation." As the lecture progressed, Grace took careful notes. Professor Wilson was actually an excellent teacher when he wasn't trying to intimidate them. His explanations were clear, his examples well chosen. Grace found herself appreciating his precision with language and the way he connected abstract concepts to real-world applications. Midway through the class, Professor Wilson presented a problem that had obvious similarities to a section of the challenge problem. Grace wondered if this was intentional, a hint disguised as a regular lesson. She quickly worked through the example, seeing how the technique might apply to her approach to the challenge. When class ended, several students hurried to the front to ask Professor Wilson questions. Grace packed up slowly, watching their interactions. The professor answered each question thoroughly, but maintained an emotional distance from his students. There was no warmth in his guidance, just cold precision. As Grace prepared to leave, she noticed Lily Park looking at her with curiosity. "You're Grace, right?" Lily asked, approaching her seat. Grace nodded, surprised to be recognized. "That's right. I saw you working on Wilson's problem in the library yesterday. Your approach looked different." Grace wasn't sure if this was a compliment or criticism. "I guess I do things my own way sometimes." "No, it was interesting," Lily said quickly. I've been stuck using the methods from our textbooks, but you seem to be taking it in another direction. I'm looking at it from a practical angle, Grace explained. Think of it as a physical system rather than just symbols. Lily's eyes widened. I never thought of it that way. Would you? Would you mind if I bought you coffee sometime? To talk about it? The request surprised Grace. In her previous college attempts years ago, she had always been the one seeking help from younger, seemingly smarter students. Now the situation was reversed. Sure, she said, but it would have to work around my schedule. I have a maintenance job here in the afternoons. If Lily was surprised by this information, she didn't show it. That's fine. Tomorrow morning? The campus coffee shop opens at 7. They agreed to meet, and Grace headed to her job with a strange feeling of satisfaction. Not only was she making progress on the problem, but she'd also made a connection with a fellow student. Something she hadn't expected at her age. The administrative offices were quieter to clean than the classrooms and labs. Grace moved methodically through the spaces, vacuuming carpets and emptying trash bins. The repetitive physical work gave her mind freedom to continue puzzling over the challenge problem. By 6 p.m., as she was cleaning the mathematics department office, a new approach occurred to her. She quickly pulled her notebook from her bag and jotted down some equations before continuing her work. The department secretary, Mrs. Winters, watched her with interest. Homework? She asked. Something like that, Grace replied. Professor Wilson's challenge problem. Mrs. Winters laughed. Oh, that thing. Been giving students nightmares for years. Have you ever seen anyone solve it? Grace asked. Not once, Mrs. Winters said, gathering her things to leave. But there's always a first time for everything, right? Those words stayed with Grace as she finished her shift. There's always a first time for everything. Just like there was a first time she'd decided to go back to school. A first time she'd aced a college exam. A first time she'd realized she might actually have a gift for mathematics. That night at home, after helping Alex with his homework and preparing for the next day, Grace spread her notes across the kitchen table again. The house was quiet once more, but with the evening quiet of a day completed rather than the morning quiet of a day full of possibilities. She reviewed what she'd learned in class, connecting it to her earlier insights. The problem was beginning to take shape in her mind. Not as an insurmountable obstacle, but as a puzzle with pieces that could fit together, if viewed from the right angle. As midnight approached, Grace made a breakthrough on the second section of the problem. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote out the steps, checking and double-checking her work. The solution wasn't elegant in the traditional mathematical sense, but it was correct. She was sure of it. Grace closed her notebook and looked around her modest kitchen. The clock on the microwave, the calendar covered with family appointments, the photos of her children on the refrigerator. These ordinary things grounded her extraordinary journey. Tomorrow she would meet Lily for coffee and share her approach. Tomorrow she would sit in Professor Wilson's class again, one step closer to solving his impossible problem. Tomorrow she would continue proving that sometimes the most unexpected people can achieve what others call unachievable. Grace turned off the kitchen light and headed to bed, carrying with her the quiet confidence of someone who had already overcome far greater challenges than a calculus problem. The campus coffee shop was almost empty when Grace arrived at 7 the next morning. Early sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors. The smell of fresh coffee and baked goods filled the air, creating a warmth that contrasted with the cool autumn morning outside. Lily was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffee cups. Her textbooks and notes were spread out, and she was scribbling something with intense concentration. She looked up when Grace approached and smiled. I got you coffee, she said, pushing one of the cups forward. I wasn't sure how you take it, so I brought cream and sugar packets. Black is perfect, actually, Grace said, sitting down. Thank you. For a moment, neither spoke. The age gap between them felt more noticeable in this setting than it had in the classroom. Lily couldn't be more than 19 or 20, while Grace had just celebrated her 41st birthday last month. So, Lily finally said, you mentioned looking at the problem as a physical system? Grace nodded and pulled out her notebook. Instead of seeing it as abstract calculus, I thought about real-world applications, like how water flows around obstacles, or how weight distributes across uneven surfaces. She opened her notebook to show the diagrams she'd drawn, simplified, versions of the mathematical expressions that represented actual physical phenomena. Lily's eyes widened as she studied Grace's work. I've never thought about approaching problems this way. They always teach us to use specific techniques for specific types of problems. That works most of the time, Grace agreed. But sometimes you need to step back and remember that math was created to describe things that actually happen in the real world. For the next hour, they exchanged ideas. Lily was clearly brilliant in the traditional sense. She knew all the proper terminology and had mastered the standard approaches. But she listened eagerly as Grace explained her more intuitive method. "Where did you learn to think like this?" Lily asked, genuinely curious. Grace sipped her coffee, considering the question. "Life, I guess. I dropped out of college when I was younger, when I got pregnant with my first child. For 20 years, I solved practical problems. How to stretch a budget, how to fix things around the house, how to manage time when there's never enough of it. And now you're back in school," Lily said. "My kids are grown or nearly grown. I've always loved math, always been good at it. The university has a program for staff to take classes, so here I am." "Staff? I'm on the maintenance crew. I clean the buildings in the afternoon and evening." Surprise flickered across Lily's face, quickly replaced by respect. Wow, I can barely manage my classes and you're working and taking care of a family too." Grace shrugged. "We all have different challenges." They returned to the problem, focusing on the third section, which involved a particularly complex integration. Working together, they made more progress than either had made alone. "I think we might actually solve this thing," Lily said, excitement in her voice. "Maybe," Grace replied, more cautious, "but we still have a long way to go." As they packed up to head to their morning classes, Lily hesitated. "Same time tomorrow?" "I'd like that," Grace said, and was surprised to realize how much she meant it. The rest of the day passed in a blur of classes, work, and family responsibilities. Grace attended her other courses, cleaned the science building, helped Alex with a college application essay, and still found time to work on the challenge problem before bed. By Thursday morning, when she met Lily again, Grace had solved nearly 3/4 of the problem. Lily had made similar progress, though using different methods. Together they filled in each other's gaps. "We should show Professor Wilson tomorrow," Lily suggested as they worked. "It's the last day of his challenge." Grace felt a flutter of nerves at the thought. "Let's make sure we've got it right first. I don't want to go up there unless I'm certain." "Fair enough," Lily agreed. "But Grace, this is really good work. Even if we don't solve the whole thing, what we've done is impressive." That afternoon, Professor Wilson's class was focused on applications of multivariable calculus in physics, a topic that aligned perfectly with Grace's approach to the challenge problem. She paid careful attention, noting connections to her own work. Near the end of class, Professor Wilson reminded everyone about the deadline. "Tomorrow is your last chance to attempt the impossible problem. I'll open the floor at the beginning of class for anyone brave enough to present their efforts." His tone made it clear he didn't expect anyone to take him up on the offer. After class, Grace headed to her maintenance job with a growing sense of determination. As she cleaned, she mentally reviewed every step of her solution, looking for flaws or oversights. By the time she clocked out at 8 p.m., she had identified 2 areas that needed refinement. Instead of going straight home, she found an empty classroom and spread out her notes. The quiet building, with most students and faculty gone for the day, offered perfect conditions for deep concentration. For 2 hours, she worked through the problematic sections, applying insights from that day's lecture. Around 10 p.m., her phone buzzed with a text from Alex. "Everything okay, Mom? You're usually home by now," she replied quickly, promising to be home soon, and began gathering her things. As she was putting away her notebooks, the final piece of the solution suddenly clicked into place. Grace gasped out loud in the empty room, her hands shaking slightly as she wrote down the insight. It worked. The whole thing worked. She could see it clearly now, how each section flowed into the next, how the unusual approach she'd taken allowed for a solution that conventional methods couldn't reach. That night, Grace barely slept. Her mind kept reviewing the solution, checking for errors, preparing for what might come next. By morning, she was both exhausted and exhilarated. She met Lily at the coffee shop as usual, bringing her completed solution. "I think I've got it," she said, pushing her notebook across the table. "All of it." Lily's eyes widened as she read through Grace's work. Grace, this is brilliant. The way you connected the third and fourth sections, I would never have thought of that. It's just a different perspective, Grace said modestly. Are you going to present it today? Grace hesitated. The thought of standing in front of the class, of challenging Professor Wilson's assertion that the problem was unsolvable, made her stomach tighten with anxiety. For 20 years she had been invisible on this campus. This would make her very visible indeed. I don't know, she admitted. What if I'm wrong? What if I've made a mistake somewhere? Lily studied her with surprise. I've checked your work. It's solid. Don't you want the recognition? This is a big deal, Grace. The question made Grace think about why she had tackled the problem in the first place. It wasn't for recognition or to prove anything to Professor Wilson. It was because when someone tells you something is impossible, sometimes you need to find out for yourself if that's true. I'll decide during class, she said finally. They walked to the mathematics building together, an unlikely pair that drew curious glances from other students. The hallways were busy with Friday morning energy, students looking forward to the weekend, faculty hurrying between classes. Professor Wilson's classroom was full when they arrived. An atmosphere of anticipation hung in the air, everyone wondering if anyone had made progress on the challenge problem, everyone secretly hoping to see Professor Wilson's confidence shaken. Exactly at 11 a.m., the professor entered the room and set his briefcase on the desk. Well, he said, surveying the class, today marks the deadline for our little challenge. Before we continue with our regular material, does anyone wish to present their attempt at a solution? The room fell silent. Students looked at their desks, at their notes, anywhere but at the professor. Even Lily, who had been so encouraging of Grace's work, seemed hesitant to speak up. Grace sat quietly in her corner seat, her completed solution tucked inside her notebook. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure others could hear it. She thought about all the times in her life when she had stayed silent, when she had made herself small and invisible because it seemed easier, safer. She thought about her children, especially Alex, who was watching her forge this new path. What would she tell him if he asked why she hadn't taken this chance? Slowly, Grace raised her hand. Yes, Mrs. Thompson? Professor Wilson said, surprise evident in his voice. He rarely called on Grace, assuming, as many did, that her age and background meant she had less to contribute. Grace took a deep breath. I'd like to present my solution to the problem. A murmur ran through the classroom. Professor Wilson's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his surprise. You believe you've solved it completely? He asked, his tone making it clear he doubted this was possible. Yes, Grace said, her voice growing stronger. I have. Very well then, he said, gesturing to the front of the room. The floor is yours. Grace gathered her notebook and stood up. As she walked to the front of the classroom, she felt every eye on her. This was the moment when everything would change, when she would step out of invisibility and show them all what she could do. With steady hands, she picked up the chalk and began to write. The classroom fell completely silent as Grace stood at the board, chalk in hand. The only sound was the soft ticking of the wall clock and the scratch of chalk against the blackboard as she began writing. Unlike Professor Wilson, who often filled the board with elegant, flowing equations, Grace's approach was more methodical. She divided the board into sections, each representing a different part of the problem. Her handwriting was clear but not fancy, the handwriting of someone who valued being understood over looking impressive. The key, she explained as she wrote, is to think of this as a real-world problem, not just a mathematical exercise. She drew a simple diagram showing how the complex integration could be visualized as a physical system, like water flowing around obstacles, or weight distributed across an uneven surface. Several students leaned forward in their seats, seeing the problem in a new light. Professor Wilson stood to the side, arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. He watched closely as Grace laid out her approach section by section. For this part, she continued, pointing to a particularly challenging area, conventional methods get stuck because they try to force the integration into a standard form. But if we look at it from a different angle, she wrote out a series of steps that bypassed the usual roadblock. A student in the front row gasped softly. Grace glanced over to see Lily smiling encouragingly. As Grace moved through her solution, she explained each step in plain language. She didn't use fancy mathematical terminology when simpler words would do. This wasn't how most mathematics was presented at the university level, but it made her approach accessible, even to students who were struggling with the course. "Here's where I connected the third and fourth sections," she said, writing quickly now, confident in her work. "When you visualize the problem this way, you can see that these parts aren't separate at all. They're actually describing the same phenomenon from different perspectives." The chalk dust settled on her simple blouse as she worked, adding to the collection of stains from years of cleaning classrooms just like this one. But today Grace wasn't there to clean. She was there to solve what couldn't be solved. 20 minutes into her presentation, she reached a critical point in the solution, the part that had given her the most trouble. She paused, took a deep breath, and looked at her notes. "This next section requires us to think about the boundary conditions differently," she explained. "Instead of treating them as fixed limits, we can see them as—" "That won't work," Professor Wilson interrupted, speaking for the first time since Grace had begun. "The boundary conditions are non-negotiable in this problem." The classroom tensed. Several students exchanged nervous glances. Was this where Grace's solution would fall apart? Grace turned to face the professor directly. "With respect, sir, I'm not changing the boundary conditions. I'm changing how we approach them." She turned back to the board and continued writing, explaining how her method preserved the original constraints while opening a new path to the solution. The math was unconventional but correct. Each step followed logically from the previous one, building toward an answer that the traditional approach couldn't reach. Professor Wilson's brow furrowed as he followed her work. He stepped closer to the board, examining a particular section of her solution. "This transformation," he said, pointing to an equation Grace had written. "Where did you learn this technique?" Grace hesitated. "I didn't learn it anywhere exactly. I figured it was the natural way to handle this type of integration when viewed as a physical process." The professor looked at her, with an expression that mixed surprise and something harder to read, perhaps respect, perhaps disbelief. "Continue," he said. Stepping back, Grace returned to her explanation, working through the final sections of the problem. The tension in the room had shifted now. It wasn't just about whether she would succeed or fail. It was about witnessing something unexpected. A maintenance worker who cleaned these very classrooms after hours, now commanding the space with her intellect. As she neared the conclusion, Grace could feel the momentum building in her solution. Each piece fit perfectly with the next, creating a clear path through what had seemed impenetrable. When she wrote the final equation and circled her answer, a small smile crossed her face. "And that completes the solution," she said simply, placing the chalk in the tray and wiping her hands on her jeans. For a long moment, no one spoke. Professor Wilson stepped forward and examined her work carefully, his eyes moving from one section of the board to the next, following the thread of her logic. The students watched, barely breathing, waiting for his verdict. "This approach," he said finally, "is unlike anything I've seen before." Grace stood quietly, waiting. She knew her solution was correct, but she also knew that in academics, being right wasn't always enough, especially when you didn't fit the expected profile. Professor Wilson turned to face her. "You've taken an entirely different path than I would have considered." He paused. "But your solution is mathematically sound." A wave of whispers swept through the classroom. Lily broke into a wide grin. A few students in the back began to applaud, and soon others joined in. Grace felt a flush rise to her cheeks. This wasn't what she had expected. Not the applause, not the open acknowledgement from Professor Wilson. "Where did you study mathematics before this?" the professor asked when the applause died down. "I didn't, not formally," Grace replied honestly. "I took some community college courses years ago. But mostly I've learned on my own, from books, online courses, and thinking about the math I see in everyday life." The professor's eyebrows rose slightly. "And you work in maintenance here?" "Yes, evening shift, science building, and administrative offices." More whispers among the students. Grace could imagine what they were thinking. How strange it was that someone who cleaned their classrooms could solve a problem that had stumped them all. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," Professor Wilson said, his voice carrying through the now silent room, "it seems I was incorrect when I called this problem unachievable for undergraduates. Perhaps I should have said it was unachievable through conventional methods." He turned to address the entire class. This is why mathematics continues to evolve. New perspectives lead to new approaches, which in turn lead to solutions that weren't possible before. He gestured toward Grace's work on the board. Remember this moment. It's not often we get to witness true innovation. Grace returned to her seat as Professor Wilson began the day's regular lesson. She could feel the other students looking at her differently now, with curiosity, respect, maybe even a little awe. Lily gave her a subtle thumbs up from across the room. When class ended, several students approached Grace asking questions about her method and congratulating her on solving the challenge. Professor Wilson gathered his materials slowly, watching these interactions from a distance. As the crowd around Grace thinned, the professor approached her. "Mrs. Thompson, may I speak with you for a moment?" The remaining students moved away, giving them privacy while still watching with undisguised interest. "Your solution was remarkable," Professor Wilson said, his voice quieter now, "not just because you solved the problem, but because of how you solved it." "Thank you," Grace said simply. "I've presented that challenge for over 20 years, and no one has approached it the way you did." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Your perspective is valuable. It would be a shame to lose it." Grace wasn't sure what he meant. "I'm not going anywhere, Professor. I plan to finish the degree." "Good. But I was thinking beyond that." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a business card. "The university has a special scholarship program for exceptional non-traditional students. The deadline for applications is next Friday. I'd like you to apply." Grace took the card, reading the name and contact information of the program director. "Why?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Because mathematics needs different voices, different perspectives." He gestured toward the board where her solution still stood. "You just proved that." As Grace left the classroom, card in hand, she felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her world. For years, she had moved through this campus like a ghost, visible only when something needed cleaning, but otherwise overlooked and forgotten. Now, in the span of an hour, everything had changed. Students nodded to her as she passed. Lily waited for her by the door, beaming with shared triumph. And ahead of her stretched possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine before. Outside the building, autumn sunlight warmed the campus. Grace paused for a moment, looking back at the mathematics building where, just a few hours from now, she would return with her cleaning cart and supplies. But today, for the first time, she had left a different kind of mark there. Not the invisible mark of cleaned floors and emptied trash bins, but something lasting, something that had changed how others saw her and perhaps how she saw herself. She tucked the professor's card carefully into her notebook and headed toward her next class, walking with a new lightness in her step. 3 months later, Grace sat in Professor Wilson's office reviewing her final paper for his advanced calculus course. Winter had settled over the campus, transforming it into a quiet, snow-covered landscape. Through the window, she could see students hurrying between buildings, bundled against the cold. "Your approach to the Riemann hypothesis application is interesting," Professor Wilson said, pointing to a section of her paper. "Not conventional but effective," Grace smiled. "I seem to hear that a lot from you these days." The relationship between them had evolved since that Friday in October, when she'd solved his challenge problem. There was a respect now, a recognition of each other's strengths. Grace had come to appreciate the professor's precision and depth of knowledge, while he had grown to value her unique perspective and intuitive understanding of mathematical concepts. "Have you given any more thought to the graduate program?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. The scholarship Grace had applied for, the one Professor Wilson had recommended, had been awarded to her just before Thanksgiving. It would cover her remaining undergraduate studies and potentially extend to graduate work if she chose that path. "I'm still thinking about it," Grace replied honestly. "It's a big commitment." "The department would be fortunate to have you," he said simply. These words, coming from a man who had initially dismissed her based on assumptions about her background, meant more than he probably realized. Grace gathered her papers. "I should get going. My shift starts in 20 minutes. Professor Wilson nodded. "How much longer will you continue with maintenance work?" "Until the end of the semester, at least. The scholarship helps with tuition, but we still need the income." She stood up and slung her backpack over her shoulder. "Besides, I like the balance. Theory in the classroom, practical work in the evening." As Grace walked across campus toward the maintenance department, she reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The story of her solution to the impossible problem had spread throughout the mathematics department and beyond. Other professors had started to notice her work, to recognize that her non-traditional background brought valuable insights to the field. But what meant more to Grace were the smaller changes, the way her son Alex now talked about his own college plans with newfound confidence, how her older children called more often to hear about her latest mathematical explorations, the growing friendship with Lily that had expanded to include other students who sought Grace's unique perspective on difficult problems. In the maintenance office, Grace changed into her work uniform, a simple blue shirt with the university logo and durable pants. Her supervisor, Tom, greeted her with his usual friendly nod. "There she is, our resident math genius," he said good-naturedly. The maintenance staff had followed Grace's academic journey with a mix of pride and amusement. To them, she was still just Grace, reliable, hardworking, always willing to switch shifts when someone needed a day off. But they'd put the newspaper article about her solving Professor Wilson's challenge problem on the break room bulletin board. "Hardly a genius," Grace replied, checking her cleaning cart to make sure it was fully stocked. "Just stubborn. Sometimes that's more important than being smart," Tom said. "Oh, before I forget, Dean Patterson wants the conference room in the admin building spotless tonight. Some big-shot visitors coming tomorrow. I'll take care of it," Grace assured him. As she pushed her cart toward the administrative building, Grace passed through the central quad where she had so often felt invisible. Now occasionally a student would wave or a professor would nod in recognition. It was a strange feeling, being seen after so many years of being overlooked. The administrative building was quiet this late in the afternoon, with most staff having gone home for the day. Grace worked methodically through the offices, emptying trash bins, vacuuming carpets, wiping down surfaces. There was a rhythm to the work that she found calming, so different from the intense mental challenges of her mathematics courses. When she reached the conference room, she found the door open and a light still on. Inside, Dean Patterson was gathering papers from an earlier meeting. "Oh, excuse me," Grace said, preparing to back out with her cart. "I can come back later." "No need," the dean said, looking up. "I'm just finishing." She paused, studying Grace more closely. "You're Grace Thompson, aren't you? From the mathematics department?" Grace was surprised to be recognized. "Yes, I'm a student there. But I also work maintenance." Dean Patterson nodded. "I read about your solution to Professor Wilson's challenge problem. Quite impressive. Thank you," Grace said, unsure how to respond to the dean's attention. "I understand you've received the Hannigan Scholarship for non-traditional students." "Yes, just recently." The dean gathered her papers into a neat stack. "That's excellent. We need more diverse perspectives in the sciences." She hesitated, then added, "The visitors tomorrow are from the National Science Foundation. They're interested in our programs for supporting non-traditional students in STEM fields. Would you be willing to meet with them? Share your experience?" Grace blinked in surprise. "Me? Your story is exactly what they're looking for. How institutions can better support students with unconventional backgrounds and valuable perspectives." The dean smiled. "Plus, I've heard you explain complex mathematical concepts more clearly than most of our faculty." The request was unexpected, but Grace found herself nodding. "I can do that. Wonderful. The meeting is at 10 a.m. Business casual dress is fine." The dean headed for the door, then turned back. "And Grace, you don't need to clean this room tonight. I'll let your supervisor know I kept you talking." After the dean left, Grace stood alone in the conference room, trying to process what had just happened. Tomorrow she would sit at this polished table not as someone who cleaned it, but as someone whose academic journey was deemed valuable enough to share with important visitors. Later that night, at home with Alex, Grace told him about the dean's request. "That's awesome, Mom," he said, looking up from his homework. "You're getting famous," Grace laughed. "Hardly. But it is strange how things have changed." Alex closed his textbook and looked at her seriously. "You know what I told my calculus teacher today? I told him my mom taught me that when someone says something's impossible, it usually just means no one's found the right approach yet." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. Of all the unexpected outcomes from solving Professor Wilson's challenge, this might be the most meaningful, that her son was learning to question limits placed by others. The next morning, Grace dressed carefully in her best clothes, simple but professional. As she prepared to leave, Alex handed her a small folded paper. "What's this?" she asked. "Just a note, for luck. Don't read it until after your meeting." The National Science Foundation meeting went better than Grace could have imagined. The visitors were genuinely interested in her journey, from young single mother to community college dropout, to maintenance worker, to promising mathematics student. They asked thoughtful questions about the challenges she'd faced and how the university had both helped and hindered her progress when Grace explained how solving the impossible problem had changed how others perceived her. One of the visitors leaned forward. "But the ability was always there," she said. "You were always capable of this work. What changed was other people's recognition of that capability." "Yes," Grace agreed, "but sometimes that recognition is what opens doors." After the meeting, Dean Patterson pulled Grace aside. "You were excellent." The foundation representatives were very impressed. She hesitated, then added, "Have you considered teaching, Grace? We have a new initiative to bring more diverse instructors into our introductory mathematics courses." Teaching. The possibility had never occurred to Grace. "Just think about it," the dean said. "Students need to see that brilliance comes in all forms, not just in young prodigies or traditionally credentialed academics." As Grace walked across campus afterward, her mind spinning with new possibilities, she remembered Alex's note. She pulled it from her pocket and unfolded it. In her son's handwriting were just a few words. "Mom, some people see walls. You see doors. Keep opening them for others." Grace tucked the note carefully back into her pocket, blinking away unexpected tears. 6 months ago, she'd been invisible on this campus. Just another maintenance worker, easily overlooked, her intelligence and potential unrecognized. Now doors were opening that she hadn't even known existed. That afternoon, as she sat in Professor Wilson's advanced class, Grace looked around at her fellow students, young, privileged, following traditional paths to success. Once she had felt out of place among them. Now she understood that her different journey wasn't a disadvantage but a strength. When Professor Wilson presented a new challenge problem, one he claimed was even more difficult than the last, Grace felt no hesitation. She began breaking it down in her notebook, approaching it from angles others might not consider, because she had learned the most important lesson of all. The truly impossible problems are only those we convince ourselves we cannot solve.